Well, welcome everyone to the July session of the Reading Pilgrimage Together discussion group. Today is going to be an open discussion. We don't have a guest speaker for today since many folks are taking time this month and next for a holiday. So we're going to have just a talk about where we are with Pilgrimage. Revolving Lights, which has some very interesting passages to talk about and developments, and also reflections on the experience of reading Pilgrimage so far. So I'm just going to start for a moment with a little update about where we are. So of course, we've been doing this since January, and I appreciate all the support that we've had and the interactions on Twitter and in these discussion sessions. Of course, keeping track of these things as you come across things that you want to react to, feel free to post them on Twitter using the Pilgrimage Together hashtag. And I'm trying to make sure that there's material on the readingpilgrimage.com website that will help elucidate and illuminate what's going on with the book, because this is a challenging text in many ways. So here we are in July, we're into volume 3. If you've got the 3-volume Virago or Dent edition, which is nice thing is we're all on the same pagination. If anybody comes out with a new 3-volume edition, we're going to be keeping an eye on whether or not the pagination stays the same, because I'll also mention that if you ever happen to get either of George Thompson's books, he references the same Dent pagination, the same Virago pagination. So the tiny world of Richardsonites tends to stay in lockstep around that scheme. So today is an open discussion. We are continuing on through the rest of the year, just looking ahead for the next couple of months. We've got Dr. Brian E. Randall from the University of Glasgow joining us to talk about the next two books, which are quite short, The Trap and Oberland, but there's a lot going on, especially in The Trap. In the next, actually, 3-4 volumes of the novel, you'll find that there's a lot more plot development than we've seen in either Deadlock or Revolving Lights. And so on to today's discussion, which is meant to be open. So I will get these ugly slides off right now and just open it up just to kind of get the discussion going. Chapter 1 of Revolving Lights, I believe, is the longest single chapter in the book, and it's interesting that it's an example of kind of how Richardson chooses to structure her material. There was a brief exchange on Twitter just the other day about the chapter structures and why Richardson breaks up her material into chapters as she does, because we've seen, I think of going back to The Tunnel has something like 14, 15 chapters in it, some of them quite short. Here, chapter 1 of Revolving Lights, as I said, I'm pretty sure it's the longest single chapter in the entire work. And what's interesting is actually in terms of time from beginning to end, and it's about 56 pages, I think, long. It literally is merely about following Miriam walking back from the Lycurgan lecture, which is really her version of the Fabian Society, which would have been down on the Strand. So if you've ever been to London, it's down close to the Thames, Charing Cross Station, that kind of area. So she walks back through the West End, through Piccadilly Circus, up Shaftesbury Avenue, and into Bloomsbury. So it's really just in the course of a walk. She does stop and have a coffee and a bite to eat in a cafe, but embedded within that, I thought there were about 3 flashbacks according to George Thompson's chronology. There's actually 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 separate flashback moments, and some of them are extremely subtle. I don't know how many of you picked up the fact that there's a certain point where she leaps as she's thinking and remembering things. She suddenly is at the Wilsons discussing a piece of writing with Hypo Wilson, and there's like no clue that where we are, just back into another section. So I'll be interested to hear what reactions, because this is, I mean, this really is this is over a third of the entire book. So it's quite a significant chunk of the narrative to be devoted to just this one passage of this, what is literally just a walk home from a lecture one night. How did anybody else have a reaction to any thoughts about the length and the structure of that chapter in particular as an opening view into this novel? And please make sure if you want to jump in, jump off of mute.
I'm not sure, Brad, if this is quite an answer to your question, but it's sort of roughly in the same area, I think. I've been doing a lot of work on people thinking about the future in this period lately, and I've been very struck by this volume, how much of it is about the future, and it's quite unusual in modernism, isn't it? I mean, you've got people like Wells who do that all the time, but the writers we tend to think of as modernist as opposed to Wells, although that's being contested more nowadays, you know, are much less concerned with the future, whereas Richardson really is. And it's, you know, a lot of this sort of mental life while walking is about going forwards, but also going backwards, isn't it? And the flashback, right, I think, are part of that sense of, you know, the mission she realizes she's on in this book, something that there is a goal somehow to it, but it's not the goal of the Lycurgians or, you know, of religious people. It's a very personal goal.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think the flashing back does seem part of that sort of sense of a vision of the future that also incorporates the notion of the past as well.
Well, in some ways, it's even though it's, you know, it's modernist, it's stream of consciousness, it's actually a very realistic depiction of how one's mind wanders as you're walking through a neighborhood that you're familiar with, as you do leap forward to things I have to, you know, things that are coming up, and then memories backwards and back and forth. So from that standpoint, it's actually quite realistic. It's believable, but for the reader, it's a little disconcerting, I think, unless you kind of clue into, oh, here's Richardson jumping into a flashback. Karen, did you want to offer something too?
Well, I don't know that I have anything super profound to offer, but I do find that I prefer when she has the shorter chapters. I find myself more engaged, you know, with the text when it's shorter. And I loved your idea of somebody studying, like, why she would do that, like have such despair, because it really is striking that, as you know, just it does seem as we progress, there's been more and more longer chapters. It's been a couple volumes now that I don't think we've had the nice little 2-pagers.
Well, and actually, I think it's in the tunnel, isn't it? Where there's less than a page long chapter, which is when she walks past the cafe that she remembers visiting with her mother before her mother's suicide, and she has this violent kind of reaction to encountering that the Tietjens, she calls it Tietjens Teas, although apparently it wasn't actually a cafe there. But yeah, I mean, that's the extreme for this, is not even a page long.
Mm-hmm.
Phyllis, did you want to offer something about that?
Yes. Thank you, Brad. I'm still really interested in while she is writing this, she herself is revisiting the past from a much further forward period, so that the comment that Max made about, thinking of the future, it's self-reflexive, but it's also, I wonder if she's going back and just repeating what she felt at the time, or how much she's folding in what she knows now. And and that, to me, that just keeps me going, because it's sort of the way the whole novel is written, is you're not really sure where she is in time in the novel, the narrator, or Miriam, but I'm also not sure where Dorothy is in time while she's writing it.
Mhm.
And the ending, I mean, when did she choose what the periods would be? I mean, was it all in her head? I mean, any stopping point, it's not as if this one does have a cliffhanger, like you said, but
Mhm.
I just don't know that either, whether this was corralling her subconscious and making it obey the 13 volumes, or if she kind of used up something and had to wait. Anyway, it just keeps me going in a funny way. I don't try to figure it out, sort of surfing her subconscious,
Well, as far as I know, we don't have any evidence that Richardson had a pre-planned volume structure for this book, that she had, laid it out as 13 volumes. At one point, I think it almost appeared like she would just continue writing until she lost the capacity to write. As it is, March Moonlight does kind of provide a nice place to end it, because it does end when she gets married, or essentially when Miriam's character enters into the same kind of relationship that Richardson had with Alan Ottle. And in terms of the time frame when this book, Revolving Lights, was being written, this is the first book, as far as I know, this is the first book she's writing after she's married Alan Ottle. And actually going from a precarious economic situation as a single woman to, in some ways, an even more precarious situation as a married couple. So defying the old adage that two can live as cheaply as one, I think she discovered that it didn't work that way.
It's really interesting hearing that, that she wrote this book about, I better confess at this point that although I've been very good in keeping up with the reading so far in these meetings, I'm only about 2/3 of the way through Revolving Lights, because it's just been a really busy last couple of weeks. So my sense of it is still coming into focus, but it is extraordinary that it's the point at which she marries Odell that she then writes about deciding not to marry Michael.
I'd never thought of that. That's an interesting observation.
And she has some particularly negative comments about men. I also have not finished this particular volume. It's the first one I haven't finished by the deadline.
This is a tough one, I have to say. I'm 5 pages from the end, and this is my second time through, but it's a slog. It's a slog.
I find myself saying over and over and over that I have to remind myself that she really was crafting this. What we know of her writing is that she did rewrite, that she took care, because on one hand, especially in this first chapter, in this, as long as it goes, you have to keep in mind that no matter how wandering it seems, that's what she wanted.
Yeah.
That had to be what she planned. And as a result, right, we read it and we think, gosh, this seems so haphazard. This seems like, where's the editor? What's going on? And why can't we have another clue? Talk about unidentified flying objects, unidentified objects galore, right?
Right.
But still, it was what she intended.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
therefore,
that's a good point.
therefore, right, I'm going slow because I know that's what there are days I pick it up and I try to read it and I just say, you know what, Miriam, can't go there. Not today. I need a murder mystery or something I can follow.
Well, what's interesting, she also, I mean, she's been doing this in the other volumes, but I really noticed it this time talking about writing and about what she likes about things and what she doesn't like. And obviously the talk with H.G. Wells, I mean, all that. And I think you mentioned this before, Brad, that this was really when he was encouraging her to sit down and write this stuff. So, and she little digs at Mrs. Browning and, you know, stuff like that. So she's revealing a little something to herself more as a writer to us than I think she had in the past, or maybe I'm noticing it more. But it is, you're right. I absolutely agree that when I get lost in it, I just sort of have to say, I'm not going to try to figure it out. I'm just going. It's kind of like Zen.
Well, this is this volume, more than any to date, even going through it the second time for me, this is the one I wished we had an audio book for this, because I think there are passages where it's as it is with a number of modernist writers, it's really more the flow of the words than the meaning of the individual words that the writer is trying to communicate with. It's almost a more poetic approach than a prosaic approach. Because there are sentences here I highlighted. I just, what does that mean? I can't even parse. I mean, I can parse it. I think we can say for Richardson that all of her sentences are parsable. They are grammatically correct.
Mm-hmm. Well, except she has this new habit of, I mean, she likes to put questions in the middle of these things, but now to me, this really jumped out that she has these declarative sentences. I mean, it's not even, I couldn't even imagine putting, and she puts a question mark at the end.
Right.
And it's not even like, I wonder if I'd like to go there. You know, it's something like the moon is white, question mark. It's, so I guess she's trying things out too. I don't know.
Yeah. Did anybody catch the shift into first person?
Yes.
Yeah.
And
where did that come from? So that's for, if you haven't, it's on page 272. It's in a passage where she's remembering a bicycle ride from outside London back to the house. And actually reading that, I just a practical question, it suddenly struck me, where did she keep her bicycle?
I think she read it
before that. I think that it's before that. And I think she actually had a first person eye in a previous volume. I remember finding that and thinking, oh, I wonder if that's a slip. But that doesn't make sense when you know that she's written and rewritten. But because what page did you say, Brad?
272.
Right. And I saw an eye before that because I haven't gotten to 272 yet.
Right.
I will peruse.
Okay.
Yeah, I have the original, so I don't know what the pages are. I've got the original book, so whatever.
While she's perusing, I had singled out that passage that begins on 272 as being interesting because I think she specifically cites like London as being her lover and so forth. And that was one of the things we had talked about in previous volumes. And so, and it's just one of the things that interests me is if you had not told me any of Dorothy Richardson's biographical data, I would have sworn this woman would never have gotten married. And so just because I've never seen anyone who revels in being alone so much. And so I'm absolutely fascinated that she not only ended up married, but that I guess, it was on some level a successful marriage. And that just really surprises me.
Well, I think it was a marriage of two very odd, two people who didn't fit in well to conventional situations. If anything, Dorothy fit better because she seemed to understand the social clues more than Alan Alda, who had this quite distinctive graphic style. I don't know if you've ever seen any of his illustrations, but they were exotic for the day, and they're still kind of odd. He mostly did pencil sketches as illustrations. I mean, the stuff he sold was mostly illustrations for collector's volumes of things like Candide and some other books. Like he made no money really. So it was Dorothy who supported them most of the time. And it was almost like I mean, we do know people like this in our lives, that the odd couples that they just
I agree.
they click somehow.
But I just like somebody who loves to be alone. I guess maybe he just lets her be alone. So that would be something, you know. I'm glad that she found someone, but it's surprising.
Yeah, I just want to go back to this passage, and several have pointed out that it's not actually the first use of first person, but it is so strikingly out of context. So we have in this paragraph in page 232 of Revolving Lights, it's third person. So when they reach the suburbs, the problem was there again in might. So it's essentially about the fact that it's, you know, they're leaving the countryside and into a buildup area, which is of course more treacherous as a cyclist. And there's a reference to the fact that only 2 of them have bicycles that were equipped with free wheels. This is something that we all take for granted now, but the first, you know, few decades of bicycles were ones where, and actually it's kind of funny, in the last 20 years, there's been a renaissance of these continuous, I think they're continuous chain bicycles. Basically, you have to keep pedaling at all times. You can't stop pedaling. You can't coast. So they're coasting downhill. And then it says, and then London in italics, which is interesting also. How many times does she use italics outside the context of foreign words is quite rare. Opening suddenly before me as I rode out alone from under a dark archway into the noise and glare of a gaslit Sunday night. Trouble fell away like a cast garment as I swung forward, steering with thoughtless ease into the southernmost of the 4 converging streets. And then it's back to, they were not in London proper, and now it's back to third. So it's literally 2 sentences that jump out as first person. It's just, yeah, why is that? I don't know if anybody among the Richardson academic or scholarly community has ever looked into the use of first person in Pilgrimage, but they're so rare that they do leap off the page, so to speak.
It must be in Deadlock that she uses the first person I, and what I'll do is I will, when I find it, I'm going to stop because I want to pay attention. When I find it, I will tweet it out, and I am B Moon, so that should help you out to find out where. Well, I will tweet this out.
Okay.
And let you know where it is. But I remember reading that and thinking it was so seemingly a slip or so odd that she would do that. Unless she, my other thought was that she was so into her stream of consciousness that she just went with it and said, okay, I'm speaking, and therefore there you go.
You could see it as introduced by the end of the previous paragraph, couldn't you? When she says only a mind turned altogether towards outward things could invent. And then this might be an example of something that mind has invented. So that would make it like a quotation of the sort of thing that someone having this experience might write later.
Right, right. Well, there are a number of sentences like that, just like that one, only a mind turned altogether, that we find in this book in particular, where she's kind of like working out for herself, how do I take this experience and these thoughts and, essentially structure them or work them into a work as opposed to simply having them flowing through my head.
Now, at the start of chapter 4, I have which is, I don't have the pagination you all do, so I'm not sure if I'm overlapping. She talks, it's the third full page, it's when she's talking about failing to let her employer know she was staying an extra day. And she, I think it's Hypo is saying to her, you ought to see the Grahams, stay another day and see the Grahams. Next paragraph, I might have wired asking for another day, impossible. And that is a beginning of a passage and explaining her feeling about Mr. Hancock and the job and stuff. That seemed much more like an internal conversation with herself.
Right.
Different than the one you're talking about. I think this is a different level of first person, a different type of first person. More that what one does during the day when you talk to yourself,
right,
in the first person. But it does punctuate the importance of the Hancock connection, I think, when she goes to the first person to talk about that.
right. Now, Max, you say that's that's the start of chapter 4, page 384.
That's where the chapter starts, but I think it's not that
It's
passage.
386.
386.
The page.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
Right, okay, yeah.
Yeah, I might, right there at the top, I might have wired asking for another day.
Yes.
And it continues, only being able to say that I came back, when I came back, that I waited to see a man dying of cancer. He would have thought that more, but I think most of us would have thought that more. But
She does have a morbid sense of humor. I mean, she puts jokes in a lot quietly, in a way, which I like, but it's a reward for going with the flow.
yeah. How have folks, I mean, just to open it up beyond Revolving Lights, what has been, for those of you who are reading, oh, I'm sorry, we have a question from, or a comment from Howard. Howard, did you want to jump in?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry I missed the beginning today, so I'm not quite sure what you discussed. I just wanted to come back on a couple of things. I think Karen's absolutely right about the marriage. Richardson thought Odell was going to die. He was very, very ill, and so it's initially a kind of idea of kind of caring for him in his final kind of period. But then it became this very successful marriage in its own way. And I had a friend, Eva Tuckers, who's quite a well-known writer in the 60s. And her theory was exactly what Karen said, that H.G. Wells, Michael Shatov, I'm mixing real people and character names here, but they were too demanding. They're too equal with Dorothy or Miriam. That's why she couldn't marry them. It would just be unbearable. The point about Alan Odell was he was very, very different. So he's this slightly older bohemian, absinthe drinking, Beardsley style artist. And he just allowed her a total space, I think, for her own thought, her own art, and to live. So they could live together quite happily, stay up all night, drinking, smoking, doing their own thing. And I think it's that aspect of space, whereas the real life Michael Shatov and H.G. Wells, and these other characters, they would have just been too, I think, intrusive, challenging, demanding, possessive for Miriam.
Yeah, it's actually there is a passage here on page 302 where Miriam is kind of, even before she has that affair with Hypo, I guess this is Shatov, where Shatov once again kind of flippantly suggests, well, we ought to get married, yeah. the door's not closed on that, right? And she kind of says, you know, we can't, you know how separate we are. And then she thinks to herself, or I guess it's in the dialogue about, I know the sort of woman he meets who accepts a man's idea and leaves him to go about his work undisturbed, sure that her attention is distracted from his full life by any practical preoccupations. And later on it says, to marry would be actually to become, as far as the first outside world could see, exactly the creature men described, to go into complete solitude, marked for life as a segregated female, whose whole range of activity was known in the only way men have of knowing things. And, you know, both of those passages are giving this sense that essentially men have this freedom to have a life outside the marriage, whereas the women have to stay in the box that is considered the conventional role for a wife in a marriage. And particularly the idea of, I mean, that you mentioned about space, Howard, and I think that's really gets to one of the key points for Richardson, for Miriam as a character. It's just, you know, the ability to have range without the constraint of the expectations of a partner. Phyllis, you had a comment you wanted to make?
Yes, I hate to bring in extraneous thoughts, but I just keep coming back to Leonard and Virginia Woolf. And there are many other examples. Stella Gibbons had a passionate affair that she was turned down for, and then married a very quiet, accommodating guy that she supported them. I mean, I think it is the room of one's own. This is part of the looking forward. I think that that an earlier commenter, I think it was Karen or Moon, was saying about how, as opposed to other, that she is looking beyond the constraints within which she was raised and trained and expected to marry or be a school teacher or governess, which is what we start at. So I think that's there are things going on in the real world that show this can happen too. So I do think that's just part of the more contemporary feeling that she has about life. Maybe not contemporaneous with this particular time period where Miriam is, but it's certainly where I think Dorothy is when she's writing it.
I'm interested in particular to know any of the women participating today about your reaction. To me, as a man, this seems like Miriam's reaction to marriage is in fact very contemporaneous to the kind of thoughts that may be going through women's heads now as they think about relationships, where you have a lot more opportunities certainly than 100 years ago that Miriam Henderson had. Very limited employment opportunities, very few kind of conventional roles in which a woman could be, and particularly in the context of a marriage under English law in those days. If a woman got married, her property became her husband's property. So you not only lost an identity, but you literally lost property in that deal.
I don't know which volume people are looking at. I'm on page 256, still in that massive first chapter. And she talks about men having no personality at the bottom. Do you remember this passage where she goes, I wondered how men felt about reading this, because I am amazed that she married at all, to tell you the truth. This is not just harsh. This is really, really angry. And the person she's talking with says, well, you know, don't talk nonsense. And she says, how can a man have a personality? And she just, it is very harsh about how men are in the world. And she sees women as completely superior, completely. Yeah. They are the thinkers, they are the planners, and there is no compromise, and yet she refers to herself as having a masculine mind a little bit earlier.
Yeah, yeah.
So
A number of times in the book, she does
Yeah.
talk about herself as that that may be one of the explanations of why she doesn't fit in, is that she wants to have the rights, she wants to have the thoughts that a man is allowed to do in that society.
Well, one contemporaneous example of someone much younger than myself, Brad, given this modern world, a woman on Twitter put out she said she was doing a little test where she went to a gathering of parents with children, and whenever they suggested play dates, the men would give her their wives' email addresses.
Right.
So don't know.
That's what I think is that, and I'm sorry, wouldn't you know, our workers showed up just to,
Okay.
get out. So I'm sorry for the bumping, but that's what I think, is that I'm just impressed that she was able to articulate all this so well, that I think even today, with so many opportunities, we still have so much social conditioning that even if you agree with parts of it, you still think, oh, a man's going to come and make everything better, and so forth and so on. And she just really seems to know, to be able to voice a lot of things that I only earned with lots of years behind. She could say it at 20, which I could barely get at 50. So I'm impressed.
Well, I mean, she was 50-ish when she wrote this.
Well,
when
that's
this
true.
particular volume.
That's true. But you guys
She
were
had been, of that time, just like Miriam, she had been a self-supporting working woman, living on her own up until the time she married Otto. And even then, as I said, I think she supported him more than he supported her. So, she knew kind of, and one has to presume, I mean, she had the relationship with H.G. Wells. She saw the marriage between Amy Catherine Robbins and H.G. Wells as kind of an illustration of what somebody like her would have been through. She saw the examples of her sisters. So she had some story of life experience to kind of say, well, when I look at, I mean, to me, what I find a lot of going on in pilgrimage broadly is one person, a woman in this case, but one person looking through the options on life's menu and saying, I don't want to eat that. A couple of folks have their hands raised. Max, did you want to make a comment?
Yeah, thanks. It's a really interesting question, that, isn't it? She's quite harsh about a lot of people or groups of people as well, isn't she? I mean, it isn't just men. And we talked in earlier volumes about the kind of class prejudice or anti-Semitism, and both of those are very active in this book too, aren't they? So then the question is, well, what do you do with all that? And I mistrust my own sort of temptation to explain it away to preserve male vanity in this case. But I think isn't there a sense that, that these aren't kind of considered opinions that someone's putting out there, as you might in a published book or something, but it's those impulsive movements of thought where you get annoyed with someone and you say, oh God, that's just typical men, they're all like that. but you don't, it's not your last word on the subject. And then she'll move to actually being very sympathetic towards Michael, say, and sort of seeing that there is a personality there, but it's just kind of compromised in lots of ways by things that men get more preoccupied with than women do. It's partly what I meant by talking about the future at the beginning, because I think one of the, I mean, I'm sorry, I am obsessed with this topic and I'll probably keep coming back to it, but there is a sense in which all the characters are thinking about the future, aren't they? The Lycurgans are sort of all the time thinking about, you know, the future of humanity. How do we, you know, how are we going to free everybody? And it's all very kind of generalized and utopian, but Miriam is thinking about the future in a very individual, feminist, different sense from that, but it is her future. You know, do I want this kind of future? Do I want to be married? Do I want to be alone? What's a future of loneliness going to be like? Do I want that? You know, it's there are lots of possibilities of it, and I take it that's part of what the Revolving Lights idea in the title is, isn't it? That, you know, there are all these kind of glimpses of this kind of life or that kind of life, or, you know, is it going to go in this direction, or do I turn off down this street?
Right. Yeah, just as a reference, Revolving Lights was like one of the early solutions to traffic control. So that was before we kind of fixed on the system that we see globally today. There were various notions about how to control traffic, and one of them was the scheme of basically having revolving, instead of the switching lights, you would be revolving lights, so the light would turn and you'd get a green and the traffic would recede. Just a historical reference. We have a couple of folks with their hands raised. Howard, is your hand raised for this discussion, or is that left on?
Yeah, I wanted to totally agree with what Max has said, that I think Richardson is trying to record the movements of thought, not censor it. So she's not trying to then rearrange everything in terms of definitive conclusions. Miriam is questioning absolutely everything. As you say, she's going through all these options: socialists, the revolutionaries, feminists, men, women, Jews, and she's questioning absolutely everything. And she gives you all the contradictions of that movement of thought. In terms of looking to various futures, there's a horrible moment, which I think is kind of echoed in one of Woolf. It might be Street Haunting, where suddenly Miriam comes into eye contact with the beggar woman in a
Yeah, it's right towards the end of chapter 1 in this book.
Yeah, that's like a kind of horrible vision of the future. But what the other point I was going to make was that one thing I find slightly depressing in terms of comparing women then, or women's situation then, and women's situation now, and I'm obviously not qualified to really talk about this, but I love the way that Miriam expresses her freedom, relative freedom, by walking, you know, through Piccadilly Circus, up Shaftesbury Avenue. She has that little scene where she meets someone from her hometown, and she kind of she sort of nods to him and then walks straight off, finding an equal with him, and knows he's going to go away and say, "My God, I met that Miriam Henderson in the middle of Piccadilly Circus, 12:30 midnight."
Tommy Babington from early on.
That's
yeah.
Tommy Babington. And then she finds this little coffee shop and she goes down and has a coffee. This is like, eventually it closes at 2 o'clock in the morning. And then she walks off back to Bloomsbury, back to the boarding house. And I guess in many ways now in London, I'm afraid to say, a single woman probably would be uneasy, I think, about doing that walk at 12 o'clock or 1 o'clock. You know, there'd be just too many problems, possible, harassment, etc. So in a funny sort of way, we've, in certain respects, we've kind of gone back. Miriam has this real freedom in whatever it is, 1903, that might not be now.
A couple more folks have their hands raised. I'm going to go in the order that I saw them. Susanna?
Well, I actually wondered about that, walking around at 2 in the morning when she's not in this book, maybe, but earlier on, she's walking like very late during the night. And I don't know, but I've never felt that the 1890s were particularly safe for women walking around, but she doesn't really comment on that, on anything. So I actually quite wonder, maybe we have some ideas about time and space that really are not there, or maybe she's forgotten because she's time has gone by, and she's sometimes you want to keep a part of your memories and discard others. But what I wanted to comment, and I'm not sure about the quality of the sound because I'm on a mobile data
It sounds
I'm not
fine.
at home. Okay, thanks. It's about these ideas about men, women, social inequality, or ideologies, whatever she's talking about, and she is being herself. She's saying what she thinks. She's not afraid to say, okay, now I'm saying something that maybe is brutal, like, no, women, they are the creators of this and that, and she's not really adhering to any particular ideology. She's not really being a feminist. Someplace I seem to remember, I don't have the books with me and I don't have a quote, but I think at a certain point she says something about giving women the vote or something like that. And it's like, well, she's not too happy about that either, because the role of women is even more fundamental than this sort of superficial stuff men are engaged with. It's like very, I don't know, women are in another level of being to her, which is quite, and it's like, are there any women writing, not even then or even later, in this really uncompromising way, and also about other stuff that she's really being herself. She's talking about what she thinks, and she's really not caring if anybody else likes it or dislikes it, or am I really and I find that so refreshing. It's like, of course you can agree or not, or you can think, okay, well, this is maybe in our way of looking at things today, but in particular, what we are always thinking, oh, but if you say this, then you are this and this and that.
Right.
She's not really in any particular box or in any particular group or ideology. She's just saying, okay, this is what I think.
Right.
And nobody else is really there. This is me. And I find it so challenging. It's like, what is she going to say now? It's so interesting to keep up with this freedom of expression and total, I don't know.
2 or 3 people haven't managed to finish it. It's all falling apart.
Yeah, well, I think that's, I mean, that's certainly one of the reasons why contemporary reviewers, particularly the ones who like only did 1 or 2 books, talked about unpleasant Miriam, because she was uncensored in her opinions. And I mean, by today's standards, a number of things she says are really politically incorrect, and she doesn't and wouldn't necessarily have been all that successful, acceptable even then. But yeah, she's I mean, she is free. She is much more open in criticism of men in the context of fiction than you would have seen. I mean, it was going on with some of the fresh suffragette movement, et cetera. But even that, I think Richardson, I mean, and this becomes a big, particularly in Dawn's Left Hand, which we're coming to, where she is rooming with another woman who gets very actively involved in the suffragette movement, goes to jail, is force-fed, not to be offering spoilers here, but you know, that she sees it. I mean, even that, Miriam to some extent kind of says, look, but even that is putting me in a box. And she's always fighting against that idea of that. I mean, to me, to go back to the menu example, what I love about this book is she is so candid in her, so often she looks at other people to kind of say, well, this is what they are. Does that work for me? And it doesn't. And this is why it doesn't work for me. She does it with Mrs. Bailey. She does it with the Borders. She does it with Michael. She does it, so many people she encounters. And honestly, I think that's quite accurate of how many of us do encounter the world. You see somebody and you go, well, could I put myself into their shoes? Does that work with me? Oh, they have this nice house, but on the other hand, what are the constraints that come with that? I think we do that ourselves, maybe not even as consciously as Miriam does. And I think that's one of the things that I love about this book. We've been
And she
talking for a
applies
while.
it to herself as well. She applies it to herself as
Yeah,
well.
absolutely. I mean, that's again, the point is, can I do this? Does this work for me? How do I get through my life? How do I get through the world and find a place with it? Which is such a fundamental question of existence, I think. But we've had a couple of folks very patiently waiting. Mark, I think you're next.
Yeah, this is just going back to the Miriam's outrageous comments, especially in this volume. From what I remember, especially, for example, the one about men having no personality, these kind of comments, they often come up in the conversations with Hypo Wilson. And I suspect that might not be what she really believes. It's just she and Hypo teasing each other, trying to be outrageous, provoking each other, rather than necessarily this is what Miriam thought and maybe this is what Dorothy thought.
Yeah, that's a good point. She has a more playful, it's actually an interesting contrast between her relationship with Michael Shattoff, which is kind of more of an intellectual one. And Hypo is intellectual, but she, you can see he's attracted to her in part because there is a sense of play, in effect, that we gathered, he didn't feel in his relationship with his wife, his then wife. Jennifer, you wanted to add something?
I don't remember what I was going to say, but I will. I've been listening so intently, but I will say a few things. Just reading her is going back to what I felt. I mean, even as a little girl, when I first started reading, and you realize that someone from the past feels the same way you do, and that's like the greatest thing about reading, is just how we can interact with someone from a long time ago's brain and ideas and emotions. And I feel that all the time throughout these novels with her, that she's just being herself and putting it out there. And she doesn't have an ism. She's just, writing in this very unusual way of writing, especially for that time. But, sometimes I like it, sometimes I don't, but I'm quite often struck. I mean, these are, as we've been talking about, the questions we still have today about how do men and women get along and what are men's roles and women's roles. And the question of Englishness, I think, is really interesting as well. What it's like to be a young woman, a man, and be English at a time when England was, at the top of the world.
Absolutely. This was Imperial England.
Yeah. And so I think that's another big thing for her to be juggling around in her mind, which I also relate to as, an American, and seeing perhaps our place in the world start tumbling down, thank God. But, there's just a lot to relate to. And one other last comment is that I was just out to lunch yesterday with a friend with 2 daughters who are telling them how much she has internalized sexism and the patriarchy. So I think these ideas are very alive and in the young generation. And my friends with young daughters are fierce feminists and really angry right now.
Yeah,
you can imagine, in this country. This is a very topical book, and we're still dealing with everything she brings up today, and with socialism and everything. I mean,
absolutely.
Thank you. She's fabulous.
Yeah, I mean, this is why it's so frustrating. I have contacted McLean's, which is the agency that manages Dorothy Richardson's estate. And I mean, these books, if you buy a copy in the US, you're basically buying a copy imported from the UK. It's
Yeah.
not really, the whole set is not in print in the US.
Right.
This
Right.
amazing book, and it's so
I
hard to
know.
get. And the agency seems completely uninterested in doing anything to change that situation.
Yeah.
So it's frustrating because to me, this is such a, as you said, it's such a contemporary book. It is still talking to, particularly, how many other books go so deeply into one person's experience, you know, through the course of years.
It's amazing.
It is really an in-depth view
Yeah.
of her life. You would have to go to somebody's diary to find a comparable example.
Right.
And particularly going through as a single person. This isn't like, she's not talking about how do I live my life as a wife. How do I live my life as an individual?
As
And I have
Pete.
to have a job, and I have to, you know, I have a job, but I'm a kind of a second class person in the job. I have to find a place to stay. I have to get along with the people I stay with. These, I mean, these are basic survival questions that people deal with, and it's amazing.
It's a lot to read through. So not everyone's going to do that.
Yeah.
And, you know, it gets a bit heavy going every once in a while, as, you know, the first chapter, for instance.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which was fascinating, but also, you know, like, wow. So I don't know. I think she's great. I think she's very topical. I think young women today, I live in San Francisco, so I may be hearing just one thing, you know, in different places, it may be different, but
right.
You know, here young women are very much questioning everything. I mean,
as
and
they should.
don't
I mean,
necessarily want to
jeepers.
get married or even think in those terms. They don't even think in terms of regular sexuality, really.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah, absolutely. And, you know, let's face it, we're all over 40 here, I think, but
Right, exactly.
you know, this is a pretty scary world to be a young person in.
Absolutely.
So many things that we could have taken for granted or just didn't question, rather, maybe, are out there. I mean, my kids are 30 and younger, so I see them going through this as well. I do think you make out a point, which is this is a tough book. I mean, I read it by myself the first time through and I loved it, but it was an immersive experience. My wife was in the States trying to fix our house here. And so I had night after night where I could sit there and force myself to go through it. And I'm glad I did, but it's so much, this experience of sharing it as we go through the volumes has, you know, opens up many perspectives, at least for me, going through it. I think it is something that you have to, it's much more accessible when you have an opportunity to raise questions and
it's a commitment.
And have this, yeah.
Well, I'd love to hear if anyone has ideas about being English and being a feminist and the beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th century. I don't know if anyone else has thought on that.
I think that might be a good question to ask next month, if you can join our session with Bryony Randall, because that is actually something that she deals with. And I think we're going to try to get a couple of our favorite Richardson scholars back to join us towards the end for a recap as we look back on the whole series, because there's so many aspects like that really open themselves up when somebody is familiar with the whole context of the setting of the nook. Howard, did you have another comment that you wanted to make?
I did. I just wanted to come back on what you both just said, which is that there's a lot to look forward to. Don't get too demoralized. The next one, The Trap, I think is totally brilliant, but kind of depressing, kind of downbeat. But once we get to the fourth volume, there are books which are almost entirely about the suffragette movement. And needless to say, Richardson, the ultimate kind of suffragette, begins to distrust the suffragette movement begins to react against it, because of course she will, because she's Miriam.
Yeah.
Oh,
The
I'm
other thing I just
completely
wanted to-
committed, but yeah,
Sorry?
I said I'm completely committed, so.
Yeah. Everyone should be in right.
Well,
right.
it's funny, just to jump into the comment about Richardson's criticisms of the suffragettes, is voicing a perspective that really only kind of reemerged in the last like 30 years of scholarship on the suffragette movement, which is in a nutshell, the message, and I think you'll see this, is that particularly like the Pankhursts, Mrs. Pankhurst, were pursuing essentially being accepted as equals, but sort of kind of not. So I want to have the right to vote, but I still want to fit into some sort of societal schema. And that's essentially the criticism that Richardson comes back with, is that, well, you're selling yourself short in effect.
Interesting.
But it's also links up to her criticism of socialist, Russian communist, Quakers, Englishness, Jewishness, that we're put into these boxes with these labels, and she starts feminism as another label which people have to kind of adhere to, which maybe contradicts their individuality. The other thing I just wanted very, very quickly to say is you mentioned how the book captures a whole life over a long period. But what I also find really incredible is the way she kind of goes into the moment. There are certain passages where she just goes into real detail of what it is to be present in that moment. There's one little bit where she's with the Litvinovs in that, Lintoff, sorry, in the room.
In their little hotel room, yeah.
East End. And she suddenly thinks, sort of, Lintoff and Michael Shattock are having a discussion. And she suddenly thinks, I'm going to stand up, I'm going to kind of walk to the other side of the room. I can't remember whether it's to get a cup of tea or to sit next to Mrs. Lintoff. But this is like less than probably half a minute in real time. It's like literally walking from one little bit of the room to the next bit of the room. It's like 4 pages. And it's like going to all the detail of how she might possibly upset the dynamic in the room. Something terrible might happen. It becomes this incredibly cool adventure. And you're really happy when she finally makes it to
I'm so glad you picked that out, Howard, because as I was reading that passage again, going back through it, I had forgotten essentially how detailed it is about what might have been maybe half an hour in their hotel room, because it's a little not very nice hotel room. And yet in some ways it's absolutely riveting, because to me, that it is, and then this is chapter 2 in the book. So it's really, once you kind of give up the fact that, you accept the fact you're going to spend a fair amount of pages in this little hotel room, but then just listen and watch, and there's so much going on.
Yeah.
And I think that's why it's maybe more intense than the first chapter. I think with the first chapter, there's these long passages of dialogue, which maybe they drag a bit. Whereas in that second chapter, everything is kind of paraphrased, I don't know if that's the right word, in Miriam's mind. So everything's incredibly condensed and concentrated. As you say, Brad, there's so much going on in that Litvinov scene. And the politics and the history of it all in terms of Russia are incredible as well. But there's just so much going on. It's just so densely written.
Mm-hmm.
You just have to kind of open yourself up to it. And I always see it as kind of vertical. Well, whereas some of Pilgrimage, it's kind of horizontal. There are certain scenes where you suddenly go deep, 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 deep into the scene, into the moment.
Right.
I find those really exciting.
No, I completely agree. It's refreshing after the first one, because the first one is really, as I remembered, oh yes, this is about her walk. Then suddenly I could kind of relax and go with the somewhat slow flow of that. But chapter 2 is pretty much all about this day with the Lintoffs, meeting them in their hotel in the East End, and then going to Hyde Park and then having tea afterwards. That's about all that happens, but she's processing overtime in the course of writing that chapter in particular. Well, we passed the hour point. It's been a great discussion. Are there any other comments or questions anybody wants to ask while we're all together here? It's been wonderful. I appreciate you all who have chimed in and offered questions and comments. It really does help the discussion open up. So if there are any other folks who want to step forward and have anything they want to offer. I think, Jennifer, you raised a question about next year's.
Oh, yes, I did.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear.
Well, just it's in a completely different vein. But yeah, I've arranged with 12 publishers that specialize to some extent or another in reissuing lesser known books. So we're going to essentially spotlight each one of those publishers and a book of their choosing throughout the course of 2023, starting with Dean Street, a book called A Game of Snakes and Ladders by Doris Langley Moore, and going through the year. Most of these books are books that are available now. In a few cases, they'll be available well in advance. I think only probably the last Faber is going to talk about a Christmas book in December that will only be available about a month or two beforehand. And it just give a chance to spotlight their list and talk about a book in particular.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to set up a website for that, or it's less heavy lifting on my part, I have to admit. But I do have a scheme for 2024 that I'm thinking about, because it's been so fun doing these things. I just have to figure out a good book that is, not Proust, but also not impossible to get a hold of.
Yeah. Fascinating.
Yeah. Okay. Any other comments or questions before we wrap up? Let me just make sure. Any other questions? The Man Who Loved Children. Phillips, can you what that was about?
That's a Christina Stead novel.
Right.
And it's very long, and it's a little grim. It's very interesting because there's a language that's invented in the middle of it. And it actually takes place near where I used to live in Annapolis, which is interesting because that's not her turf at all. And I've read it a couple of times, and she's also a similar, she reminds me of Dorothy in a way, that she never really made it with any of these things. And she was always scrabbling around, and the relationship with her husband was a little questionable. And there were a couple of good there's at least one very good biography of hers that could illuminate some things too. And I just find it a fascinating, you think you're going to want to like somebody and then you can't, but you want to. And so you're sort of teetering all the time on this kind of a very uncomfortable situation. So anyway, just a thought. It's
yeah, it is one of the most commonly recommended little known books. So it's one of the best known little known books, so to speak. Randall Jarrell was a big fan of it. Numerous other, very reputable writers have pushed that book at time to time. It is in print now, which is great.
Yeah. And one other that is not as obscure, I think, would be Ultima Soul, which is Henry Handel Richardson.
Right.
And that's more of just not a yarn, but it's got more of a just for its own sake, not leaving you scratching your head the way some of these other ones do.
It's more plot driven, let's say.
Yes.
Okay. Any other comments or questions before we break up? Well, thank you all for participating, and as always, this will be available when we in a day or two on YouTube. Take care, and we'll see you in August. Bye-bye.